Hi, everybody. It's Bob Ost, and this is the Friday Community Gathering at Theater Resources Unlimited, also known as TRU. TRU. We are an organization dedicated to nurturing and supporting and helping producers and anybody who makes theater happen, producers as well as self-producing artists. We have a lot of self-producing artists with us today, as well as commercial producers. So the reason we've been doing this is because we were in shutdown, and now we're almost not. I'm not exactly sure where we will be in a week or two, but so far everything looks good in New York, and we seem to be coming out of shutdown, and we're actually able to look ahead to reopening theater, live theater. Um, I have guests today from other parts of the world because there are many things that are similar that we're all going through, and there are also many things that are specifically going on in different parts of the world. So I think it's healthy for us to look outside of New York every now and then and see what's going on elsewhere. So I'm really happy that I've got these two guys here today, two producers who are involved in reopening of theater. One is in London and one is in Australia. And actually, the one in Australia is also involved in opening things in London and New York. That's Neil all over. So I'm going to bring you guys in, and I'm going to ask you to say hi to the room and tell us a little bit about yourselves and your backgrounds pre-COVID. And then I'm going to actually ask you, if you don't mind, to give me an honest assessment of what it was like when you went into the shutdown and how that affected you, and how well you were able to cope with everything. And then I want to bring us up to now and what's going on now. So, Ramin, let's start with you because I haven't met you before. Pleasure to meet you. I'm so happy that Cody introduced us.
Hi, great to meet you, and thank you so much for the invite. Nice to see also some friendly faces in amongst the virtual crowd. Um, I started producing theatre professionally in 2014, and I've kind of consistently done a mix of lead producing and general managing off West End shows while co-producing larger West End shows, and eventually meeting in the middle to start kind of lead producing shows. I also do a lot of finance work for theatre, and I also, as a hobby, I'm an economist for the government here.
Yeah, I think that's worth noting. You are actually an economist for the government, for the exchequer,
which was a that was my lockdown change.
Oh, that was interesting.
Yeah. So I my first big show I was involved in London was Gypsy with Imelda Staunton, and I've done quite a few shows since. Another highlight was 1984, which came to Broadway.
That was brutal.
Uh,
That was a brutal show.
um, which, yes, so did very well in London and less so in New York. And
Was Carl White on that with you? Carl.
I think so. There were a lot of people, as
Yeah.
always, on Broadway. And I also did the co-produced the Ferryman on Broadway and upcoming Company, which we also did in London. I am also a co-producer on The Prince of Egypt, which I worked quite closely with Stephen Schwartz on for a while, which opened on February 25th, and we had a few weeks of running before we were shut down.
2020, February 25th.
In 2020.
Yeah. We've had another February 25th since then.
Yes, I always forget that. And which actually just reopened last night, which is kind of quite the achievement. And I'll leave any more for kind of questions and discussion.
And I just want to point out that Ramin made a very good distinction between plays that he actually was involved in commercially as a participant, as an associate producer, whatever title you want to give it, and plays that he's actually taken the lead on. You've actually been involved in plays as a lead producer as well. And there's a big difference between the kinds of choices that you get to make depending on where you are on that kind of ladder of hierarchy. So I'm interested to hear what happened with the commercial pieces that you were part of and the ones that you were also lead producing on. Neil, are you lead producing some things as well as associate co-producing?
Yeah, it's in Australia. I'm pretty much the lead producer on most things that I work on. And there's a play going off Broadway that I'm the lead producer on. But I'm a bit like Ramin. I also then co-produce into the UK and some of the projects in America as well.
So tell us a little bit
about
that.
Vastly different depending on which one of those roles you were on. March the 11th last year or March the 12th, it was vastly different about how that went. Because obviously, if you were the lead producer, and I was the lead producer at that point on the Bridges of Madison County had just opened in Australia. I was doing a tour of a Joni Mitchell cabaret show called Blue across the USA, and that was instantly a nightmare on those projects because not only were you suddenly dealing with shutdowns and financial losses, but every single phone call and email that you were responsible for on those shows, that fell on my shoulders. Whereas something like Back to the Future that I'm a co-producer of in London, that was supposed to open, well, that had opened in Manchester right around the same time and got shut down 2 days after its opening, but that was heading to the West End. And on that one, as a co-producer, you still have to deal with financial losses and you still have to deal with the carnage of what's going on, but that was Colin Ingram that had to take the lead on that and be the person that had to make all the awful phone calls and the emails and try and unpick the mess.
I'm trying to think. Cody Lassen, when we were talking about this on the panel that you were on previously, talked about the unproduced. It wasn't unproducing. He used the term. Basically, you had to actually go through.
I think it was unproducing. Yeah.
The unproducing process. Just undoing all the contracts and figuring out how to rework them if they are reworkable and how to find the language that would actually cover you for being able to come back. The irony, though, is that when we spoke last year, and I don't remember exactly when it was, I should have checked that, you were in a very positive place. We were suffering here in New York. We were like in a dreadful shutdown, and it was just spiking all over the place, and it was a mess. It was a horror show here. And you in Australia were saying, well, we've just reopened. It's like, la-di-da, you reopened, okay.
That would have been January, February this year. So I've been living in New York for the last 2.5 years.
It was January.
I managed to live through all the shutdowns over there. Look, Australia did remarkably well in 2020. So we're a big island in the middle of nowhere. They shut the borders very quickly, and the reality of being in Australia or New Zealand, for that matter, is it's a long way to travel for most people. So if you shut your borders, and you shut it at a point when there's very little COVID in the country, then through 2020, Australia did a remarkably good job. 2021 has been a horror show in terms of a vaccination rollout. And I would say right now, having flown out of New York a few weeks ago, I've just watched Australia and New York trade positions, basically.
That's actually true. That's absolutely true, though.
And it's probably because Australia's vaccination rollout, we relied on one vaccine, which was AstraZeneca. It's just been I do not understand how our government has mishandled it so badly. But we are currently ranking last in the OECD world of countries that have vaccinated and that's by a percentage of population. We've only got 25 million people. And we're still coming last compared to countries like the USA, the UK, all these huge populations that are 10 times our size or more in the case of the USA. And this is a cautionary tale in my head because we're ready to like break open the doors and just say, here we are, we're back, we're doing it, and we are doing that to some extent, and it worries me a little bit because you can
regress. I mean, there are problems that you can create. The good news is in New York
Well,
we have
Australia,
we have a 70% vaccination rate in New
Yeah.
York right now.
And Australia has been a roller coaster. So I think when we spoke last time, it was January or February. I had I'm the lead producer of a show that I conceived and developed called not didn't conceive it. I had it just developed and produced called Drama Queens. And in January, Australia's theatres, or late December really, but Australia's theatres started opening up, or Sydney's did. Melbourne was shut down at the time. And so I played this game of coming back to Australia, quarantining for 2 weeks. And during that quarantine period, there'd been a small outbreak in Sydney's northern beaches. And so the whole question was, is Sydney going to go into lockdown? Can we go ahead? Have ticket sales just gone off a cliff because people stopped booking tickets the minute that COVID is mentioned? And the reality in Australia was that those early shows that opened, so in Sydney, that was Pippin, Magic Mike, Frozen, they got belted around. Like, so there was a lot, and same in Melbourne, like the earliest shows that went on in an environment where COVID was still present. And when I say present, I mean 20 cases in Sydney, or Brisbane shut down over 1 case at one point. So I feel like phase one was filled with a lot of losses on big shows with big, when Disney can't sell Frozen that well in Sydney, that there's a market that's struggling. And then since probably April, my reading of Australia is that it really turned a corner, and suddenly you started getting Hamilton coming into Sydney, and there's a production of Phantom of the Opera that's gone on sale in Melbourne. Harry Potter reopened, and so there was suddenly a lot of shows selling a lot of tickets. Not everything, a lot of shows, like a lot of smaller unknown shows or unknown shows generally that weren't branded, they were having a tough time. But our subsidized theatre companies are not-for-profits in your world that have subscribers, and anything with a title like chess, fantasy, that they were doing really well. But in the middle of that, what people, because I saw the New York Times articles and the Washington Times talking about how this amazing, this Australian bubble existed and theatres were open, and they sort of gave the impression that everything was selling out, which certainly wasn't the case. And in the middle of it, for example, you get something like Come From Away that has been just cruelly dealt with by the universe and by COVID, because that's now been shut down for the 4th time in this country because of COVID. So right now, so I guess what this is leading to is that just as things were starting to look positive, not the vaccination, Australia had no cases of COVID. Melbourne had been in lockdown again for a while. So Harry Potter and a few other shows in Melbourne had been shut down. They were finally starting to reopen, but Sydney was bubbling along and Brisbane was doing really well. And then about 3 weeks ago, when I was sitting in quarantine again, coming back, because I've got the tour of Drama Queen still going here, a limousine driver who was unvaccinated, a transport driver that was unvaccinated in Sydney for whatever reason, there's government investigations into that now. He transported an airline crew. One of those had the Delta variant. And so the Delta variant now is basically the only variant in Australia pretty much. So we're a bit of a petri dish for scientists to go, what happens? Because I mean, wherever else the Delta virus is mixed in, it's usually mixed in with a lot of other COVID cases. So it's a bit hard to tell exactly what it is. So right now we're watching the Delta variant go through an unvaccinated population.
So it's not unreasonable for me to want to be cautious, even in New York, where everybody's like saying we're fine, we're fine, we're fine.
Oh no! I think if you've got 75% vaccination, like New York has, you probably are fine. I mean, not everybody's going to be fine. Like some people with the vaccine are going to be in the 10% that find the vaccine doesn't work on them, and then the other 25% of the population that aren't vaccinated are still going to catch something, I would imagine. But no, I mean, the problem in Australia right now is that we're not vaccinated inexplicably.
Ramin, can you give us a little view of London? London has been a roller coaster too, as far as I was aware.
Yeah, I mean, so things were kind of looking quite positive after the end of summer last year, and the government had done some pilot studies, and then just as some theatres started to open up, and I was working on the immersive Great Gatsby that was that opened. Just as things opened, then cases started to rise, and we were kind of going into greater tiers of restrictions. Shows had kind of a few weeks of running, and then there was a lockdown for 5 weeks, and then opened again for 2 weeks, only for the alpha variant to take off, and everything was shut again for about 5 months. But what
I have a question for both of you. Do you think that your governments and our government could actually have known enough to have been more cautious, or I mean, was it a complete surprise, or was there like maybe
no.
a hint?
I mean, so
Well,
any yeah, so you go.
You go, Ramin. You go.
I mean, I think no one with kind of really big shows, no one with really massive risks to take took it, because everyone knew that this is probably too soon. I mean, having then done work in government on COVID and knowing that no one has ever looked more than a month ahead, kind of shows why a lot of things happened, and how political things are, as opposed to being led by a kind of strategy with an endpoint.
So
that's what I'd say about Australia. I mean, like I said, I think the government did a very good job in terms of protecting Australians, particularly Australians in the country. Like, there is an argument here that there's a lot of Australians stranded around the world that basically can't get home, and that's in violation of the Constitution and all sorts of things. But with the vaccine rollout, it's been badly mishandled. And the problem is now, like Ramin was saying, we're coming into a federal election, and so a lot of these decisions right now, it's hard to know. Oh, so I should have said, so the end result now is that Sydney is, so I came out of 2 weeks of quarantine. So to get into Australia, it's almost impossible if you're not an Australian at the moment. Then if you come from overseas, even if you're vaccinated like I am, you have to quarantine in a hotel for 14 days, where you are not allowed to leave your room. You don't even get a room key. You get charged $3,000 to do that. And then, so I have come out of 2 weeks of quarantine, and 3 days before I came out of quarantine, Sydney went into lockdown because of this escalating cases. And then in the days since, and the other thing that happens in Australia is all the states start closing their borders to each other, which is ridiculous. But so as we currently sit here, large chunks of Australia, like all of our capital cities, pretty much except for Melbourne, bizarrely, which has been the one that's had the most lockdowns, we are now shut down. Brisbane should come out of that today, and maybe Perth as well. But what that means is just carnage. So like in Sydney, Come From Way, like I said, has been shut down again. I've had to cancel my tour of Drummer Queens. In Perth,
I think I'm gonna reach out to Sue Frost and see if she wants to talk at some
Sue
point.
Frost
Yeah.
and Rodney McBee and
Randy.
That show has been everywhere it opens. It was shut down twice in Melbourne. The unluckiest shutdown of all time in Brisbane, where Brisbane's only been shut down once before this, which was just 3 days, but it was the day after the Come
I
From
hope
Away.
it wasn't my fault. On my birthday, March 11th last year, I went to see Come From Away. It was the last show that I saw, and it was the night that before Broadway shut down. I loved Come From Away. I just absolutely loved it.
It's my favorite show at the moment in the world. But so the problem is in Australia, so when you ask about could governments have known? I mean, governments should have known what was possible with an unvaccinated population, if any. I guess there's been a number of leaks in Australia out of hotel quarantine.
We have science deniers here in America. Do you have science deniers in your countries, to the extent that we have them?
Yeah, we do it. Not really. No, not usually. What we have in Australia, Sam Levy, who's an Australian producer in New York that's on Come From Away and on 6, summed it up perfectly for me. He said the other week, and before this outbreak happened, somehow the Australian government has convinced people to be more scared of the vaccine than they are of the virus. And that was because, honestly, the number of deaths in Australia over the last 18 months.
Nice going.
Yeah. The number of deaths in Australia over the last 18 months, the number of cases, you wouldn't find an Australian that knows anybody that's had COVID, except for Michael Castle. One of our biggest producers actually was one of the first people in Australia to get it. But now that's changing, and now the questions are coming about, well, why aren't we vaccinated? But there's a lot of people even the last few days that people being told not to take the AstraZeneca vaccine because of blood clots, and sadly in Australia that's all that's available at the moment, pretty much. So it's a mess. But what that means for theatre, for example, is so Harry Potter has been allowed to reopen after the lockdown, but they are at 50% capacity, and
is it the condensed version or the full version? Because we're getting the condensed version.
We still have the two act version.
Yeah. I spoke to Sonia a couple of weeks ago. Who said that it's just hemorrhaging money. That she's losing like $250,000 a week. Even, and that's why I think that there is some like state support for that, but it's still Harry Potter needs all of full capacity to function.
Wow.
Disney had to open Frozen in Melbourne at 50% on the assumption it would go up. But then if you look at Sydney, so like I said, we've got Come From Away, we've got Hamilton, the Opera House, American Psycho was playing, and then there's any number of like subsidized theatre companies and smaller companies. Everything just had to shut down overnight. And the problem in Australia is the rules are different state by state sometimes. And so tours that go from, we're in Brisbane, and then we go, which is in Queensland, and then we're going into regional New South Wales, they've all had to shut down. West Side Story hasn't been able to open in Perth. So it is, I mean, and right now the other problem in Australia is there is no, our equivalent of the PPP scheme has finished.
For those of you who don't know, PPP is the payroll protection plan. Our government has done that very well. We've had 2 rounds of PPP for all, but not small business. It's supposed to be small businesses, but the huge businesses were getting them as well.
And in Australia that was called JobKeeper, but it was done very well here as well. But it's finished in March. So the problem now is every actor. So the actors on Hamilton, you might have seen it was on the Broadway briefing yesterday, but the actors on Hamilton and Come From Away in Sydney, they've just been stood down without pay because the producers cannot keep any more losses running. Because of course there's no insurance for this kind of event anymore, and there's no government support. So right now it's a bloodbath in Australia, and like I said, it was not expected that this kind of outbreak could happen, but it was not unforeseen either.
No, that's what I don't understand. I mean, just with a modicum of caution, we could have protected ourselves a lot more. But we didn't have any. We had last year. We had an administration that didn't take this seriously enough. I think we've come around. I think we have a much wiser administration now. That's an understatement for some of us, but let's just put it at that and leave it. Ramin.
Well, and I'll describe it to people over here is that the vaccine rollout in the USA has been a miracle. Really, I mean, in March when I came back to the US in March, got vaccinated the next day, but that was really when it was only in the middle of February that vaccines started becoming widely, available. They
became available in January. They became more available in February. I was in seven of the groups that was supposed to get vaccinated immediately, and it took me 6 weeks to get it, but that's fine. I mean, compared to other countries, I think we did very well. And I think it's a lot to do with Biden. I know that there are points of view on both sides of the issues, and I try to stay as neutral as I can, but it's sometimes hard.
I guess the other advantage the USA has is they're manufacturing. Australia's biggest issue at the moment is that we're not manufacturing the vaccine. We're relying on buying it in, and so the one vaccine that we were relying on early was at the university, and it fell over at the last minute. The testing didn't allow it to be distributed. So that's when Australia got very trapped into having to wait at the back of the queue for vaccines to become available around the world.
So, Ramin, can you give us a little bit more about the details of London's dealing with the Delta variant now too.
So because we've done pretty well at vaccination, but it's been very strict by age, or if you're a kind of a health worker. So it's been very steady. But we kind of keep going well. So kind of 85% of adults have had a first dose, and about 65% have had a second dose. And that's kind of we're doing well. I mean, with the Delta variant currently, there are loads of cases in London, Like I know so many people who've either tested positive or have to isolate right now. But actually, because the vaccines have kind of work in preventing serious illness, it means that we're not seeing people dying, and that's what matters. And so actually now we're ready to kind of fully open up on the 19th of July, which was delayed from what was meant to be the 21st of June because of the Delta variant, and it was that the government extended that by 4 weeks to buy more time for more people to be vaccinated.
I think when I first was looking to do this panel with you guys, it was the 21st. It was around when that deadline had sort of been moved.
But again, kind of we expected that was potentially optimistic anyway. So on the Prince of Egypt, so with the current stages that we're allowed to do socially distanced for indoor events. So for theatres, the rule is that it's 50% of capacity. So the Prince of Egypt, we always believed that we'd still be socially distanced for the summer and only put a socially distanced capacity on sale, even though our first performance was meant to be after we were allowed to have full capacity. Whereas Andrew Lloyd Webber tried to open his Cinderella back in on the 25th of June, which was kind of very, very foolish. Whereas every other show that can only really function with full capacity left that opening date quite a bit later, so that they have that time to adjust. But for me, what I'm worried about is whether we go backwards, because once open, it's very hard to then shut down and close again. And we were always asking for, irreversibility is much better.
That's actually worth looking at for all of us, because a lot of us in this room are producers or producer hopefuls, and let's talk about what is involved, and again, keep the distinction between the shows that you're the big shows that you're helping and the ones that you're leading.
Yeah. So with Prince of Egypt, it's I am a co-producer, but was quite involved with the management, because I'm very kind of close with the lead producer. So I did a lot of work in the run-up to opening, and did a lot of work in the closing. So and help kind of come up with kind of how we structure some things in terms of keeping people on payroll. So there was a furlough coronavirus job retention scheme here, but it actually wasn't available for actors and stage managers, because Equity about 10 years ago won a case to make all actors self-employed, so that they're not full employees, which is better for them for tax purposes, but then meant that they couldn't qualify for this employee retention scheme. So all actors basically just got a kind of single payout to suspend their contracts 4 weeks after we closed last year, and that was kind of agreed between the Society of London Theatre and Equity. But still, just kind of, I think a big part of what the producing team had to do is keeping in touch with those actors and making sure that actually we could hold that company together, because we only reopened with 2 weeks of rehearsal, because for a mega musical,
really,
because the entire cast came back, and they'd done it enough that it was in their bones. And it was there that we only replaced kind of one swing and one like very brief part. And so if actually we hadn't kept those actors kind of vested and believing that we care about them, then there would have been a lot of atrophy, and it would have been a lot harder to reopen, and would have taken more time and money that we didn't really have.
Well, give us the specifics. How did you keep them committed and
so
loyal?
I think it was a weekly or very, very regular Zoom calls with the entire company. And I think it was kind of constantly keeping them updated with the thinking, because there were a few times where we wanted to come back sooner. And so they knew that basically that we were always working to try and bring them back and give them their jobs back. And I think that confidence was there, but that other shows didn't necessarily have. I think we also benefited from being very new, as that meant that there was kind of more of excitement of being the first cast of a big musical, and we fortunately managed to get the cast recording done before we opened, so we had that as a to release, and which got a Grammy nomination. So all this kind of, there were things that kept everyone going. But it's really tough because the show itself didn't get any support because there was a government scheme for the arts, but that was designed for kind of organizations rather than productions. So we didn't really qualify, and though we did get an insurance payout, that we were insured for 4 weeks of running costs for force majeure, but then it was still didn't really get as much insurance payout as we wanted, and there are some things that need to be kept running, and for instance we paid a lot of advance hires for lights and sound, which was a great deal at the time because we got those costs down, but the hire company said, no, you've paid for that advance, you're not returning this equipment to us, so you have to pay for it even though it's not being used. So all of these sorts of things that affected a lot of shows where the hire companies said, no, keep paying us as per our deal, or we come and remove them from the theatre. And the cost of removing a big chunk of lighting and sound is so much that it was especially when we believed that gap would be shorter, it was just not worth it because we wanted to be ready to switch on the lights and go back in, which we've been able to do.
So this has been a financial nightmare, obviously. Congratulations on seeming to have survived it, though. You seem to be on top of it all.
Yeah, but then it's the if we have to close again for more than a week, there isn't really the resources to reopen again.
Neil, what was your journey with just take one of your projects as an example?
Well, I'll give you two. If I look back at March 12th, when Bridges Madison County had to shut down, there was issues everywhere because when something goes into lockdown like that, we did it because we were only a shortish season, so we knew kind of that was for the end of the show, at least for that period of time. We might come back. We couldn't even get the things out of the building. So our set, and like at that point, there was no trucks available in Sydney because suddenly lighting companies and hire companies were getting all their gear from all these shows everywhere. We couldn't get crew. So there's just so many tricky things. But if I look at the last 2 weeks in Australia for Drummer Queens, I've been in contact with the cast, with the theatres, because there's a chance up until the lockdown happened in Sydney, we were trying to get an exemption to go into the ACT to keep the tour going. So it's, we might be going, hold on, we'll know soon, we're waiting. And so there's so much communication that has to go on with cast, with crew, with creatives, that's exhausting. And then when it gets pulled like that one had to, then there's this torrent of logistics that need to be dealt with, like cancelling sound and lighting hires and dealing with venues and future venues for that tour, and the fallouts of, are they going to charge us cancellations, or does this fall under some sort of government public health order, which means they don't, or is it somewhere in the middle where we're still going to get charged a per ticket fee to change the thousands of tickets? Can we afford that even if they're going to charge us? Because suddenly you instantly burn through any cost that you've already worn to date. So your marketing, for example, you never get that back. And if you are 4 days out from opening, which we were, most of your marketing budget has been spent, and that's just gone.
How have you been dealing with your investors?
Luckily on Drummer Queens, I don't have any. So it's just the creator and I have all the money in that, because we did receive a very generous government grant to develop that show. On my other shows,
oh good Lord, I wish something like that existed in the United States.
On my other shows, it's problematic because my investors in, say, Back to the Future or Room in Canada, they put the money into that show because that was supposed to be opening in May 2021. No, it was open in Manchester in March 2020, but we were hoping to be into the West End by the middle of last year. And so the issue now becomes, I mean, everybody's understanding, they get it, but there's a purely financial thing where they put money up for that in late 2019, and Back to the Future will now open on September the 13th in London. It's previewing a bit before that. So, you know, best case scenario, it's probably a year from that point that it will recoup. And so by that point, we're talking about September 2023, by which point my investors will have had their money wiped out on that show for 4 years. And that is a problem for other projects now, because that same pool of investors may be with me on 2 or 3 shows, and all of the shows look like that for them. So it's just stagnated everybody's money. You don't get to pull your money out, you know. So raising money for future shows, I have some investors that are, you know, I think everyone's happy with the way it's been dealt with, and everybody's happy with the risk and why it's happening. And I know it's extraordinary circumstances, but there's a practical reality that some people just go, I don't want to put more money into anything right now because I'm not confident, full stop, in theatre. I'm not confident that there's no insurances to cover anything else for COVID. Or they're happy with those things, but their money is wiped out on projects that should have been running a year and a half ago. So that's tricky.
Oh, yeah, it is tricky, I would say so. Melissa Bell asks a question, but let me sort of rephrase it a little bit. What is your position, or what do you think the relative wisdom or foolishness is of reopening a show at a capacity that doesn't give them the opportunity to break even?
I think it depends on what. I mean, you have to do an analysis of kind of what the situation is, and also just how much capital do you have? How important is it as a signal to audiences that you're open, and it's kind of driving people through to get momentum to a point where you can have full capacity? I'd say it's sort of a judgment for each show, but something like Harry Potter is a brand. It doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to drive momentum, but it probably actually, there is only so much money that it can lose. It is still funded by individual investors. It is still a limited company. And actually, once capital is gone, it's gone. And I mean, something that Harry Potter may be able to raise new funds, but that's pretty rare. And actually, I was having this discussion with Sonia that she's considering, like, is November too early to open? And I was like, well, what are the costs of opening like too late? And like, there is no too late, but there very much is a too early, because if you spent all that money to reopen and then have to close again, and as you say, most of that spend is wiped out because so much of it is marketing that it's gone. You know, you then can't recover. You can't go back to people again. And I have that same issue of, well, investors, you know, may be understanding they're not going to be putting any new money in until stuff starts coming out again.
And my thoughts on that are, I mean, I was very, very opinionated about getting back in the market early. And if I could have done, I would have had one of the first shows off Broadway. Before that kept getting delayed and delayed. Having been belted around now by a few shows, I'm very much of the opinion, let Disney and let people with very deep pockets do exactly what Ramin was saying. So somebody needs to be in there first, and somebody needs to give confidence. But my advice now is let it be somebody else, because the first it's very much like an army. The first wave of soldiers that ran into this got slaughtered, and then the second wave of people can come through and go, okay, now we can actually make something work here. And the other thing I should say about Australia, and the interesting thing here, is that, because what worries me about London and the USA clearly is the virus, but it's more the lack of tourists. So Australia, we have a lot of tourists that come to Australia, but they are not theatre going tourists in a lot of cases. They go to theatre, but our numbers here do not rely on international tourism to be successful. Whereas London and New York, that's not the case. And so so even if the locals are vaccinated, if my fear for Back to the Future is what happens when we exhaust that UK audience, and that should be Broadway's biggest concern. I mean, 70% of the audience of New York doesn't come from New York. 30% of that is from overseas and 40% of that is American. So unless there's tourism back and back solidly, I don't understand the economic model that would allow all the shows to reopen and to succeed. You're going to get your outliers, you're going to get your Hamiltons, you're going to get your shows that do well. But I think there's going to be a much bigger bottom end of shows that don't do well until tourism starts again.
But I could just pick up on that, but it's that different shows have different audiences, that I think that the Lion King is going to be much more dependent on tourists. And I actually find it insane that the Lion King and Wicked have announced opening when we have no idea what international tourism is going to be. Because at least something like Back to the Future or The Prince of Egypt, because they're new shows that actually there are lots of people that still want to see them, that actually there is enough audience to fill, that is not reliant on tourists. So it's only really once you get past year 1 into year 2, 3 that tourists start becoming the bulk of an audience. And we have and the West End is a bit more play focused, and the audiences for plays are largely very much local audiences, so they can do fine. And I think the West End has also in recent years adapted more to doing a lot of kind of light entertainment that's a lot less risky, and doing more
not in recent years. That's always been London.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of even more so. And at the moment, like the theaters are actually saying yes to anything, just so that they have something to go in, because once they've set up all these protocols and put that investment in, it's like, no, we just want content through the doors. So there's just a bunch of drag shows on now in the West End,
okay.
because they're cheap and cheerful and they have an audience.
Cheap and cheerful. There's a good title for you. Jane,
the other thing I would say is that somehow, if I look at Australia's situation, where as we keep shutting down and reopening, theatres are pushed again to the back of the line, where I don't know how this happened. And I think it's because maybe as an industry, we were so proactive early in trying to prove how safe we were. But somehow globally, and certainly in Australia, we have managed to convince ourselves and the government and everybody else that theatre is the most risky place to be sitting in to catch COVID. And I don't know why that is, because what happens in Melbourne, and we're going to have it here in Sydney, is that when theatres are allowed to reopen, they're at 50%, but usually capped at like 150 people or something ridiculous like that. And then it staggers up. But it staggers up behind sporting stadiums, which I know are outdoors, but not all of them. We've got indoor tennis centres here. We're behind churches. We're behind gyms. We're behind... And to my understanding at the moment, there is no science anywhere that says theatres are an increased risk. In fact, I think there's no case proven anywhere that has been transmitted in a theatre globally. So that's a strange...
Well, there was the backstage horror of Moulin Rouge, which is...
I think, yes, that's true. But I think that was before anybody knew what COVID was. So I think since then, when there's protocols in place, but it is a weird situation, because I think we're going to keep seeing this the whole time, that if there is the problem with the shutdown is that theatre gets shut instantly. There's no protection. But coming out of a shutdown, theatre is not just allowed to reopen when the rest of society, when everyone's going back to work and when schools are reopen. Theatres are still have this long lag time where they're not allowed to operate on a commercially financial basis. Like if you're told it's 50% houses or even 75% houses, you're not covering your costs probably. And so even if you're selling all those tickets, so it's a strange situation.
Certainly 50% you're not covering your costs.
Jane
Dubin, why don't you turn on your audio and ask your question? So you'll ask it better than I do.
Hi, I'm a commercial producer here in New York, and I was just curious, there are a number of New York shows that have, I don't know if they publicly announced it, but they're certainly doing Australian tours in the fall. I was just wondering whether you thought that, at least Moulin Rouge and Jagged Little Pill, there may be others, but I'm wondering if you thought that those would actually happen.
Moulin Rouge will absolutely happen, because Carmen and that whole team are Australian. It's also sold a lot of tickets in Melbourne. So the question is, will it be able to open in May? I think it is. No, not May. When will it? it's been pushed back. I keep getting confused now because these things have been pushed back and pushed back, but it can't be that far from, they're rehearsing now. So right now in Melbourne, they can open because Melbourne has no restrictions after being the city that had restrictions. Jagged Little Pill has been announced for Sydney and is on sale. I think they probably have enough breathing space between where we are now and before they open to at least not be caught up by the current immediate problems. But I mean, selling tickets is going to be hard. But Moulin Rouge is a much bigger title, and it's Australian film as well. So there's a love of that film here. Jagged Little Pill, I don't know how it's selling, to be honest, but what I do know is in Sydney that Hamilton and Phantom of the Opera and Cinderella, the Rodgers are all selling huge amounts of tickets. And so I do go, well, how many shows? We have more shows in Australia post-COVID than we ever did pre-COVID. It's ridiculous. Like every theatre is full and every theatre is filled with musicals. So a lot of companies that don't normally do musicals, like Sydney Theatre Company did Fun Home. And there's a theatre company that does almost exclusively plays called Belvoir. They did a show called Fangirls. The Opera House hasn't been known to do that many musicals. They have had Rent and American Psycho, and they've got Crybaby. So everybody's gone musical theatre crazy because everyone loves musicals and books for musicals, even the theatre companies in Australia that don't generally love musicals. And then there's a lot of small, like the Hayes Theatre Company, and there's a lot of companies doing musicals. And at some point, the money has to run out.
A similar question to you, Ramin, would be what is the theater scene? Oh, thanks, Jane. Nice to see you. What is the theater scene like outside of London, and what is going on outside of London?
So yeah, so a lot of tours are like either underway or planning to restart. I mean, I think touring is less. A lot of the theaters are not opening if they can't open at full capacity. So I'm a co-producer in 9 to 5, which is planning a tour that's meant to start in August. And actually, because they were recapitalizing, and I just said, like, I will only put the money in if I can see a very clear plan for what happens in the, I'd say, more than likely event that this tour gets shut down. And I actually probably wouldn't have gone into it were it not for the fact that then there were lots of kind of future plans that they'd lose rights to, because I still think that it's very vulnerable, and there is just this dead weight loss that you get if you have to close mid-run, and because touring is so contingent on dates. So what they've done is moved it back a tiny bit from where it was meant to be, and you know, we've got some resilience in contracts that would never have been allowed in the past, but you know, it's still very risky, and I think riskier because also we may move into a world where we have more localized lockdowns, and so if you're very unlucky and there's a local lockdown in a place where you're touring to, then that doesn't help. But I mean, I wonder whether that's harder in the States, in where each state is actually going to have a different set of policies, whereas here, kind of Scotland has a different policy to England, but there isn't that much overlap. So
what Ramin just said there, Bob, is really important, I think, for people thinking, particularly people that are looking at putting money into shows as investors or co-producers. I've just agreed to be one of the early co-producers in Birmingham of a show called What's New Pussycat, it's a great idea. Jodie Petro's written it. It's a Tom Jones. It's
brilliant. I saw the workshop like 5 years ago. It's amazing.
Right. Is it based on the song, or is it based on the Woody Allen movie?
No, so Jodie Petro's written the script. It's the novel Tom Jones reset into London in the 60s and then set to the music of the singer Tom Jones. It's a great idea, and it's really fun, really well executed. But before Gareth Lake and I signed on to that one, we went through, because you know, Gareth and I are both co-producing together on Back to the Future. We went through with Floaty and his team that like the whole potential roadmap for the next few years of going, okay, so after Birmingham, what happens, and you know, is there a tour in place, and what's the West End plans, and what's happening around the world, and even down to going, what is the we need to know very early, much earlier than you normally would, what the split of subsidiary rights is and licensing, because the experience of the last few years has made producing and raising money harder. For me, I don't know if everybody's finding the same thing, but you go, just justifying to people that it's a good use of their money to maybe not see it for 4 years is hard, when they can go and buy an investment property and watch that probably go up in that 4 years pretty solidly. We're talking about here.
We always talk about investing in theater being more fun. We push the fun aspect.
Usually I agree with you, but there's nothing been fun about the last 2 years of investing in theatre. You're just watching. So that's the problem, is that suddenly it's lost its fun as well. And oh, look at my
your aura.
Godlike halo.
Yes. So what I was going to ask you, Ramin, if I don't know how much you can talk about this, or if you can at all, but tell us a little. Could you mind sharing a little bit about your government work, and whether your working with the government has given you any more insights than maybe other people would have about what's going on?
A little bit. I mean, so particularly in the last few months, where I've happened to be working on the government's COVID policy, well, the kind of economic side of the COVID policy, and actually my job was to evaluate how we might approach if we need to bring back restrictions later in the year, and then how that moves forward. So I was kind of very aware that a lot of this optimism is very false, and actually it was more understanding how little the government had planned for kind of further contingencies, as to how few people are actually working on it. Because
did you think you had a little bit more
going on to the now?
Were you privy to a little bit more insight than some other people might have been in theater?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think that there's there is so much kind of concern about leaks that actually there is any information does get generally shared, so that it's not embarrassing if it gets leaked. So there's actually very little that is secret. It's more kind of what is important that is potentially not that I kind of had a greater insight into, and also kind of managed to be playing both sides a bit and trying to highlight what was important, and trying to push for kind of reinsurance schemes. And
can you tell the room what your title is?
So I'm an economist. So I'm in a unit in the Treasury that I kind of go from project to project. I'm basically like an internal consultant, and where I kind of there to flex the capacity of the department and do kind of analysis that always kind of leads into kind of policy creation. But this is just something I kind of started last year, when I decided to not try and lead any shows that would be reopening for a while, and took a bit of a step back from what I was doing on The Prince of Egypt, and I've been doing a lot of kind of development work on theatre stuff on the side. But so we've managed to have a lot of insight, and also just see how little also theatre kind of comes on government radar, that actually it's just so small as an industry when you're looking at the entire economy. And I think that's why it just kind of it gets very left behind.
I have a gripe here in the United States, which is basically that almost every politician, any politician, doesn't matter what the party is, when they do speeches and they talk about policies, the arts are almost never, probably never mentioned.
Yeah.
And it depresses me, to be honest.
Mm.
Do you think that you were able to bring a little bit more awareness of the arts, or by your position?
I think a little bit. So I think we have a bit more awareness of the arts, but not that there is actually a business behind it. I think that there is the idea that we have subsidized institutions and that's it, and not really understanding that there is this whole vibrant commercial sector that generates a lot more activity than the subsidized sector, and And so that's why when the government did come up with what they called the Cultural Recovery Fund that was to go to arts organizations, they said like, well, this is done now. We don't need to do anything else. And actually, because there wasn't really an awareness that there is a commercial world that actually needs support in a very different way. That actually what we wanted is not necessarily handouts, but loans and insurance, which was kind of not really forthcoming.
Okay.
And I think it's important too to remember. I mean, it's become blatantly obvious. I think everywhere you listen to governments talk about theatre, like so they do talk about the arts. Like I think exactly what Ramin said. The arts and the subsidised world is amazing, but that's when they talk about the arts, that's what they're talking about. It's easy for us to forget that our business model doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but also it doesn't. I mean, even internally here, you're explaining what the difference between co-producer is and investors and producers, and politicians really have no understanding of what we do, how we do it, which is not great if they're the arts minister, but it's also understandable in the same way that, I love sports, but do I know exactly the ins and outs of how a Major League Baseball team runs and how their finances operate and where they're, no, I've got a vague idea of how I think it works, but we have to remember, so they really don't understand what commercial producing is at all and how that is a business and how that survives. They understand their dance companies, the opera companies, all the things that are cultural and arts.
I would say that here in the United States, we don't even have that much awareness. It doesn't even go that deep. I just think it's pathetic. I've been calling, when politicians contact me, first thing I ask them is, I'd like to hear you mention the importance of the arts in a speech. Just once. There's only one candidate for mayor of New York City who mentioned the arts, and that was Catherine Garcia. She mentioned it 3 times during a debate. And I was like, whoa, you got my vote. So we'll go past politics for a second. Candy Carl wants to know whether you feel that the smaller shows and smaller entities have a better shot right now of reopening and being successful than the larger ones.
Yeah, I saw Candy's question. Can I just jump in there? So Candy, it's not that the larger shows and venues can't make a go of it. Well, they are losing money in a lot of cases, not all of them, but that doesn't mean they're not giving it a go. So the problem for smaller shows is that every theatre is full with big shows. So if Frozen loses money and if Pippin loses money, and if that doesn't mean that they're not still there. And like I said, there's more shows now in Australia advertising across it, because the other thing is there was a shutdown, right, where nobody was selling tickets. So when it opened, it didn't matter whether that show was opening 2 weeks later after the shutdown came out of it, or in December that year, they all went on sale at the same time. And so the scramble for everybody's discretionary money was on. And it's very obvious in Australia. And like I said, subsidized theatre companies are doing well if they have a subscriber base. Subscribers have been very, very loyal coming out of COVID, whether that's be for opera companies, theatre companies, dance companies. They are very loyal to the group that they want to see thrive coming out of COVID. But I would say, and I don't know with authority if any smaller shows are doing fine. I'm sure if you're very cheap, you can make it work. The big distinction is between branded titles and non-branded titles to me. And even if you're a branded title, like Frozen, if you hit at the wrong time, or Magic Mike in Sydney, if you hit at the wrong time, even branded, you still struggle. So I don't think there's much room left. This also ties to an earlier question about, do I work with new writers and new plays? I do all the time. I've built a career out of that. Right now, that's not a way that you can survive, because audiences right now, and at the end of the day, that's who we rely on to have a viable business model. Audiences are not that interested in new works, in my experience. Right now, they want to see something, even something like Chess the Musical, which has never been a hugely popular show in Australia. A concert tour of that just sold out in no time, because I think everybody went, oh, we know the name Chess, and that makes us feel slightly comfortable, even though we've never really flocked to it before in any numbers. So right now, even like I said, a lot of my development work for the next 3 to 5 years is still with new writers and with new works, but I would not be putting those on stage right now.
Okay, well, I want to open up officially to the room. If you want to do a virtual hand raise, or if you want to ask a question, now's your time. Um, I know that Ramin has to leave soon.
Yes, I
So
probably
if
need
you,
to go, but I'll hang on for a couple of questions.
yeah, Elizabeth, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Well, I see a hand raise. Who is that? Is that RK? RK, what's
Can
your
you hear
question?
me now?
Yes, I can
Okay,
now.
great. Hey, thanks you guys for coming in. Hello, Neil. Good to see you. Glad you're well. Um, one of the things that we've been struggling with in a show that I've been uh, lead producing, Bo, which is a new Lions of Pakchar musical, is how do you get through the pandemic? And so what we've done is that we've now green lighted a film, a live capture that will be distributed to regional theaters around this country, and there's about 70 of them that are kind of in a subscription basis, and we'll be reaching out to educational theaters. And so for the next, for the fall, we'll get that out to the theaters and help to develop an audience in place of what we would have normally done, which would have been a live tour or regional theater development and the like, hoping to propel it to New York sometime in 2022. And it actually is probably about as expensive to develop this new musical that nobody knows. It has a book that it's not based on anything. So, Neil, according to your your description, it'd be really hard to sell in this thing. But we're hoping that by the time things turn around in 2022, there will be an appetite for something new. And by putting it out to a much larger audience, we hope to be able to build that momentum. So when we do initiate it in New York, we can actually capitalize on a live production in the theater and hopefully
Well,
be successful with it.
Ramin has an answer to part of what you were saying. He's saying, I mean, you can say it if you want, Ramin.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I think that there's a lot of people who are just so excited to go back to the theatre that they almost sort of see anything. And so there is a lot of, as I say, what we've had this more kind of gradual opening where it's all kind of cheaper things that have taken these first slots in West End theatres that would never normally be in the West End. And because they can operate at socially distanced capacity, and people are going and things are doing relatively well, because there is demand. I think now that a lot more is opened, I think that's already disappeared. But I think there's definitely more opportunities, and so there's a production of the last 5 years that's going into the West End that would never ever have gone into the West End in a normal time, but because it's a 2-person show, it can work. You can do it at 50% capacity and it's fine, and it has a base of an audience. That sort of thing is happening, and things that there normally isn't a deep enough pool of your kind of general public to go to. So I think there is, and also I think there's a lot of innovation happening in terms of streaming, that is adding to some degree of auxiliary revenues that make things a bit more possible, or at least there's some kind of diversification.
I have a question about
that's where I would
pricing,
say
guys.
every market is different too. So that's where Australia, for example, opened up with Pippin and Frozen, and the UK's had this phase, which I had hoped in New York. I had hoped there would be a phase where they would start with the smaller theaters first, and so off Broadway may get a proper run at something without the big Broadway shows blasting away. And obviously, we only had Blindness and which had no actors in it. I suspect that the USA is going to look a lot more like Australia than the UK, because the UK's had this really fascinating phase where Katie has been able to get her last 5 years on. There's been theaters that have had all of Nika Burns's theaters have had this program that have taken in younger producers with unknown shows, and
Neil, is that Katie Lipson? Is that Katie Lipson?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I think what's going to happen, and it already is happening, that Broadway is now blasting money left, right, and center to try and get ticket buyers, which looks more like Australia. So I go,
No,
so having
which raises a question for me of pricing. What is your ticket pricing? We have shows that are reopening at astonishingly high ticket prices, like The Music Man is one of them.
Yeah, Australia's been more. I thought my gut instinct. RK, I'll come back to you in a second. Hello, by the way, I owe you an email. Actually, let me deal with RK for 1 second. Everyone should go. Having said that, I think new shows are difficult. Bo is a work of excellence, and I've loved it for a few years. And like Doug Lyons, Ethan Pachar are some of the best writers out there. So go and check out Bo, because like I said, it's a hard pathway for a show that's unknown, but that's a work of excellence. So Bob, ticket price, and I will email you back. Okay, now I've got internet in my apartment, so and out of quarantine. Intuitively, everything for me said that ticket prices had to drop coming out of COVID. What's happened in Australia is they have got more expensive, and people are paying. So it's not like nobody's paying to see shows. They are, but my fear is, like I said, the money runs out at some point, and I don't know when that is, because in Sydney, if you've just paid the better part of $200 and something to see Hamilton, and Phantom of the Opera is selling out at the Opera House at like its top ticket price is $300. That's unheard of in Australia. Unheard of. Like that would be ticket prices pre-COVID were $140, and that was the top end. And so some shows have gone crazy, and my fear is this probably ties into what Jane was asking before. I go, is there still money left for Jagged Little Pill? Like, because what people have done is already chosen their first favorite shows. They want to see Hamilton first. They want to see Phantom of the Opera. They're booking a lot of tickets to Cinderella, and so you go, if those tickets for those 3 shows have cost them what they would have paid for 5 or 6 shows pre-COVID, when does the money run out?
Yeah, agreed. I'm concerned about the ticket pricing. Ramin, if you need to leave, you just
yes, I might need to run shortly. But I mean, I think here it seems that ticket prices have basically just returned to what they were before. I haven't seen a huge pricing effect. I think that it is obviously very variable, dependent on what the product is, as to what people will pay. But I haven't observed in yet any particular difference. I would have given kind of narrower supply, whether there might be some degree of price growth, but I think it's not going to be not of that sort of order of magnitude that you've seen in Australia.
I'm just concerned that by trying to overcompensate by charging extremely high ticket prices to compensate for the amount of money that's been lost so far on the show, they may be shooting themselves in the foot, because they may be limiting their audience. Yeah. They may not be. Maybe they're right. Well, I mean, I know that living expenses for us in the United States were 25% lower during the shutdown. So a lot of people had the ability to save money, but a lot of people weren't earning money either. So I don't know where it falls.
I think it depends on what your show is. If you're Phantom of the Opera, if you're Hamilton, then you can probably charge more for your tickets than you were pre-COVID. The on-flow effect of that, though, is I suspect what you're going to see is this bigger gap open up between the number of shows that do well, because the shows that are doing well already are doing better, and but I fear that's probably removing some shows that may have done okay before. I think there's the bottom end is there's a lot more shows that are losing a lot more money, because the top band of shows, the most popular shows, are able to charge more money and people will pay it.
Bob, I wondered if Ramin might expand one comment that he made just before he goes.
Sure. Yes.
He was talking about auxiliary revenues, and I wonder what that might mean in London, because I'm thinking about bringing my Alfred the Great play from New York to the UK. So when he says auxiliary revenues, I wonder if he's talking about things like merchandising rights that are helping the shows.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of more specifically just talking about streaming, which I think probably like doesn't make much difference on a big show, like the relative income from that, like what I think it's Broadway on demand, or here it's stream.theatre, which, you know, actually if it's not a massive production, getting an extra 10,000-20,000 pounds through the door, which actually I have seen happen, you know, can make a big difference between something being vaguely viable or not. I think I'm not sure how much this will last. I personally would not spend money to watch theatre online. So I don't know how much that's going to sustain once lots of things open live. But whether it's just kind of created a different afterlife for shows, and that ties into these kind of other kind of subsidiary revenues from licensing and merchandise. But I think it's very much dependent on what the product is as to how viable these sorts of streams are.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, guys. I'm gonna let you go now.
Yes,
but
great. Thank you so much for having me. This is great, and I hope to be back soon at some point.
Oh, good. I'll ask. Like, that means I can ask you back. Oh, good.
Yeah. And good luck. Good luck, everyone.
Thanks, Ramin.
Bye bye.
And thanks Neil for being with us today. And I want to thank everybody who's here with us today, and anybody who's out there in YouTube land watching us. We do this. We've been doing this for 64 weeks. I think it is now, or 65. I don't know how many it is. And we do appreciate people having issues about money during what we've been going through in the past 15 months, and we do let people come for free. We do ask, though, if at all possible, join as a member of TRU, or donate money to us if you want to help us to keep going. And that URL is TrueDonate, TRUDonate.com. It's as easy as that. TrueDonate, TRUDonate.com. Also, I hope you'll join us for the third play in our True Voices play reading series, presented with the support of R.K. Green, there he is, he's on the screen. So it's the Storyline Project and TRU present the True Voices play reading series this year, as it was last year. So it's No One Cries for the Blacksmith on July 11th with Tony winner Chuck Cooper and Tony nominee Robert Cuccioli. And it's directed by Tony winner Tanya Pinkins. So it's a pretty good lineup of people, and it's a really good play. So I hope you'll come and support us. That you can go get tickets for at True Box Office, TRUBoxoffice.com, TRUBoxoffice.com.